You're listening to Latin Waves with your hosts, Sylvia and Sylvia Richardson. Latin Waves is more than just hot rhythms. This is a show about community, about creating a culture that is inclusive and based on fairness. Because everyone deserves dignity, respect, and has something to contribute. A new world is possible, and it all starts with us. I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Michael Lebowitz. He's a renowned professor at Simon Fraser University. He's Professor Emeritus of Economics at Simon Fraser University, and he has written many books, among them one of my favorites, Between Capitalism and Community. Thanks for being with us today.
No problem. I should mention that, first of all, I write as a Marxist economist and a socialist, and that theme has been brought out in a number of books previously. One was Build It Now, Socialism for the 21st Century. Another was The Socialist Alternative, Real Human Development. And another was The Contradictions of Real Socialism, The Conductor and the Conducted, which is about the Soviet-type economies. Many of these books, aside from my first book, which is on Beyond Capital, the political economy of the working class, many of these books emerged out of my experience in Venezuela, or reinforced by my experience in Venezuela, which we can talk about at some point, because I was there for 7 years as an advisor. But let me tell you a bit about this book, Between Capitalism and Community. It's a criticism of capitalism, not surprisingly, but not only for its exploitation, but also for the deformation of human beings. And it's an argument for building a new society rooted in solidarity, a society which I call community. And this involves a critique of neoclassical economics and the capitalist society it's based upon, but it's also a critique of determinist and economistic trade Marxian analyses. In particular, it asks the question, what kind of people are produced within a particular social relation? If we look at Marx's Capital, we see him describing capitalism as producing atomistic, alienated, deformed human beings who look upon the requirements of the system as self-evident natural laws. In other words, people who are produced to think of capitalism as common sense. And Marx goes so far as to say the nature of the system is such as to support capitalism in perpetuity. Well, that sounds very strange for anyone who hasn't had any experience in thinking about Marxism, because presumably everyone says, well, it's going to be subject to its contradictions, it will collapse, etc., like that. And that's an argument that I reject entirely. So if you have a system which creates people who look upon capitalism as common sense, the question is, how does such a system come to an end? And many Marxist economists say, well, crises. The falling rate of profit will create a crisis, or overproduction will create a crisis. I look at that, and I look at what Marx has said in both Capital and in his preparatory notebooks, that in fact he recognizes negative feedback. In other words, capital does not just sit there and die when there are crises. It responds. It responds and reacts and attempts to return to the process of reproduction, even though it is faced with periodic crises. And I argue that the only crisis, that one can see in Marx, of a crisis of capitalism that does not seem to have automatic negative feedback is the crisis of the earth system, because both capital and the workers produced under capitalism tend to support accumulation, continued growth, etc. So then that raises the question, well, again, under those conditions, what can possibly bring that system to an end? And here is one of the things I've stressed since my first book, but I keep coming back to it and learning more about how to present it, and that is what Marx called the concept of revolutionary practice, which is the simultaneous changing of circumstances and human activity, or self-change. In other words, societies under these conditions, society both changes, you both change circumstances and you change yourself, transform your process in the process of activity. In other words, we can think of, well, every activity involves two products. It's the change in things or circumstances and the change in human beings. And that second product, the change in human beings, is often forgotten. We see certainly the second product of capitalism by itself is that deformed human being, that atomistic human being. But the process of activity, the process of protagonism on the part of workers and all human beings is one which transforms them. It's one in which their capacities increase. And so, in other words, what becomes central from this perspective is the issue of protagonism. And nobody really described this better, the issue, than Friedrich Engels. And I just want to quote something from Engels when he wrote about the workers' battle over the 10 hours workday. He said, "The working classes in this agitation found a mighty means to get acquainted with each other, to come to a knowledge of their social position and interests, to organize themselves, and to know their strength. The working man who has passed through such an agitation is no longer the same as he was before, and the whole working class, after passing through it, is 100 times stronger, more enlightened, and better organized than it was at the outset." In other words, when you have protagonism, when you have this process of struggle, you in fact find that the working class and all people are transformed not only individually but also collectively. And that was something actually in the Venezuelan Bolivarian Constitution, which talked about participation and protagonism changes people both individually and collectively, etc. So there's that whole focus on human development in this process. But that raises the question, okay, capitalism sit back and do nothing. What happens when it starts to face a working class which is unified, a working class which is stronger? Well, capital's answer is divide the workers, find ways to separate them in order to defeat them. And Marx talked about this, not in Capital, but in an article. He said, well, look at the English workers and the Irish workers. They are divided. They have antagonism to each other, and that antagonism is the secret of capital's success, and capital knows it. In other words, dividing the working class, separating them, dispersing them in one way or another is a way to strengthen capital. And in that perspective, one should say, all right, the struggle against racism, the struggle against sexism, the struggle against anti-immigrant activities, the whole question of the distance between workers in different countries, all of that weakens workers and supports the reproduction of capital. And so I say, inherent in the logic of capital is to divide the working class. Now, many Marxists never say that. They look at capital and they say, well, the logic of capital is to increase productive forces. If you're just increasing productive forces, I argue in the book, then in fact the effect of increased productivity is that workers are the gainers of this. They are the beneficiaries of increased productivity, falling prices, and rising real wages. So in other words, the only way that capital can prevent that situation, which of course is contrary to its requirements, is to divide the working class.
One of the points you raised is so on point. I grew up in Latin America during the war, the dirty wars. That's, I was a child born in war. And one of the things that I remember distinctively was the power of unions in the community. Most people were starving because the minute the war hits, the inflation just seemed to happen almost overnight, where you could buy a Coca-Cola the day before for 25 cents and the next day it was $1.50. And so the unions were the only way that people would have like access to affordable food. They had co-ops and things like that. And that experience really stayed with me, how in the midst of what seemed a crisis, because war is traumatizing to everybody. But in the midst of that, the people who were engaged doing something, mobilizing the community, doing something, had a very different experience of the war than the people who were simply paralyzed by the effects of war, the people who were just frightened and scared. And I love that you point out that when we are participants, not only in investigating why is this happening, how is this unfolding, what part do I play, that recognition that it's not just the environment but also our participation that affects how things turn out is important to me. And I wonder if you could talk, because you make it so clear, the vision of Marx has been presented to us as if we own the means of reproduction, then we'll be free. But you're saying it's not just that, it's also the antagonism that is inherent within the capitalist system. What was your experience in witnessing the organization, say, of the community councils in Venezuela?
The experience of seeing the communal councils in Venezuela was really exciting. Now, I had been arguing for a while about the importance of protagonism and revolutionary practice of transformation of people through their activity. But when you went to Venezuela and went around to the communities where had communal councils, you could see this right before your eyes, how they were transformed, the pride that people had. So you'd have a case, where the communal councils, which were composed of, in the urban areas, of 200 to 400 families, and they were small enough to have their general meetings in the whole, the assemblies of the whole. Then they would create from that a communal council with representatives who would not be, the representatives that we normally think of in terms of democracy, say, in Canada. No, these were people who were called voceros. They were the voices of the communal councils, but they were part of the communal council. So when you got the communal councils during Chavez's period would put in a request for funds for a project that they had identified. And they would identify, for example, very often, the necessity to build housing in their area. There was a point when we went around, this is myself and my wife Marta Harnacker and a few others who were working for our institute, that we went around to these communities and they would tell you, well, we got money for 10 houses, and we took this money and we stretched it to build 12 houses, and we did this by, such and such ways, etc. And you'd go to another community and they'd say, we got the money for 10 houses and we made 15 houses out of that. Because in a small house you don't need 2 bathrooms. So they would in fact build these places. Or you'd go to areas where they had taken money for improving the roads, and always this enormous sense of pride. Well, that was certainly the whole process that one could see in the communal councils. Now, Marta did her work primarily in the area of participation and worked with the communal councils. I was specifically working on the side of workers' control. So I went around to many of the community, to the workplaces that had been seized by the workers, and would talk to them and discuss this. And one could see in certain of those cooperatives now running the workplaces, you could see in some cases a real development, and especially an understanding of every part of the process of producing the particular items they were producing. Some cooperatives were not so successful and continued to be struck by, overwhelmed by a focus on self-interest. And later I can tell you some of those stories, that might be of particular interest. The whole neoclassical theory, which is models capitalism, is based on the assumption of atomistic, self-seeking, actors, that everyone is out there for themselves, etc. But Marx, when he wrote, looked at the latest, works in economics, and he interpreted and drew from them. Well, at this time, we could say that there are experimental behavioral economists who have been pointing out real problems in that neoclassical model of the atomistic, human being. And one of the best examples of this in one study was a case of a daycare. And the daycare workers decided that people were, coming late to pick up their children. So they decided to put a penalty, monetary penalty, on people who came late. Well, neoclassical theory would tell you, okay, people will respond. They'll stop coming late. Well, in fact, it worked just the opposite. More came late and never came back to the point of picking up their children at the same time, at the proper time. And why? Well, they said, okay, coming late's just another commodity I can purchase. I now don't have to worry about the issue of whether it's fair or not. I'll just pay the fine. And there are examples after examples of that, which indicates that it's wrong to think of people as atomistic individuals who have no past, who have no intention of, future, who live, as atoms. In fact, people do have a sense of fairness. They have a sense of, community, but that sense is violated and crowded out effectively by offering money as for doing something, as opposed to focusing on what is fair and what do you think is appropriate behavior under those circumstances. People live as if they have a past with other people and anticipate having a future with those other people, and that under these circumstances, they want to be treated or viewed as good people. So that suggests, that there are two motives. There's the solidaristic, community-oriented motive, and then there's the self-interest motive. And one of the things that one writer, Samuel Bowles, wrote in a book called The Moral Economy, was that, the tendency was if you offered a material incentive, then what would happen would be that would go against the solidaristic incentive. And his argument was, well, under these circumstances, and his subtitle at one point in one of the chapters was on how good monetary incentives are no replacement for good citizenship. And he looked to the whole question of, well, let's bring them together. Let's find a proper mix of, material incentive and moral incentive. I looked at that and I said, well, no, the fact that there are these two quite different perspectives on how to live in a society points to two different organic systems which produce and reproduce their own premises. A system of capitalism which reproduces the capitalist and that oriented, wage laborer, and a system of solidarity, or what I call community, which produces people who are solidaristic, who care about each other, etc. So that's then the question of between capitalism and community, because these two systems, in fact, coexist. They coexist, and not only do they coexist, they also at the same time infect each other, deform each other, interpenetrate each other. Between capitalism and community, we are in this mixed situation. And so the question then becomes, well, all right, fine, how do we build community? How do we move from capitalism to community? And of course the answer is protagonism. In every sphere, in the community, in the workplace, but also struggles over racism, struggles over patriarchy, struggles over climate, struggles over immigration, etc. All of these struggles build capacities. All of them change the people engaged in them. And that becomes the basis of a new society, the potential for a new society. Chavez called the communal councils and the workers' councils cells of a new socialist state, a new state which emerges within the context of the old top-down state. But that, of course, raises, even though the people are transformed by protagonism, it doesn't happen in a void. It doesn't happen in a neutral situation. These people who are transformed by their protagonism are also being formed by capitalism, formed by the focus on self-interest, etc. And one of the things I write about is what I call the paradox of protagonism, because the protagonism of a particular group increases certainly solidarity and common nature of the people within that group, but at the same time, it separates from other groups. You know, a community which has great successes in developing its community and its community sense looks at the next community as different. They're outsiders, etc. And it's not only that, as a spontaneous effect of protagonism, there's also the fact that separate and struggles, all these different struggles, produce separate silos. What brings these together? Because those are the people who have to change, who have to develop unity, who have to develop solidarity beyond their small groups. So that raises the question, how can we change things?
One of the things that, as you speak, was just music to my ears is the idea that not only do we grow in strength and capacity through our struggles, but that we also can learn to expand those circles to include other groups. I'm always reminded how in North America, we see how the idea of nation states or states, can be a great force to uniting people, but it can also be dividing, right? Within, indigenous people feeling displaced and constantly aggressed against within an Anglo-Saxon community that doesn't see itself as related to others. And so this idea of othering people, how essential that has been for capitalism to create rifts among workers. We have so much in common. We're all being exploited, and yet we're all fighting each other, while at the same time we're being expunged, of every ounce of labor we can give the system. So I wonder if you could say a little more about the way the society, the way that this adherence to laws that are unjust not only exacerbates the exploitation and the way that people are being reproduced in deformed ways, right? Like we're constantly being deformed by our adherence to unjust laws that allow us to see inequality and injustice, like, bringing, foreign workers just for the season and being paid extremely underpaid while doing the same labor that other workers here are doing.
One is the question of, certainly capital relies upon the state to enact laws which facilitate the ability to separate workers. And another is the extent to which capitalists in their own, functioning try to do that. So, for example, in the recent, strike over Kellogg's, one of the main things that was being struggled against was the two-tier, wage system, in which young workers would be coming in to perform the same labor, same as people who had been there for many years, but at far lower wage level and with very little ability to move out of that situation into, the higher tier, etc. That's a way of dividing the working class, and that's the union in this particular case recognized that and fought against it. It still has the two-tier system, but it's reduced it quite significantly as a result of the several weeks of strike. Finding ways to fight against divisions is absolutely critical. But, some people, Marxists, many of them, will say, or political activists will say, well, the struggle, or focusing on the struggle against racism, that just simply separates workers. We shouldn't have those kinds of struggles. All workers should be joining together against capital and not going off in these separate spheres of a battle against sexism, a battle against immigration, etc., or pro-immigration, etc. And that question of, well, those struggles, are digressions from the real struggle, forgets about the human being. That human beings, through passivity, sitting around and just complaining, through their struggles, change. And it's those changed people who are most able to make the link to other struggles and to engage in solidarity. But the thing I want to stress is it's not spontaneous. It doesn't happen automatically. And that then raises the question, how do you unite workers? How do you break through the separate silos? How do you develop a real challenge to capitalism?
Mm-hmm. So how do we do it?
Well, one of the things is that I argue, and it's something I've argued in a few books, but most explicitly in this one, is my last chapter is called The Political Instrument We Need. And it's an emphasis on the need for a political instrument or political instruments which can be involved in all different struggles and can point out the importance of unity, the links between struggles, etc. And when I say, political instrument, it's not the kind of political instrument that one also often has simply described as the vanguard party, in which the party at the top selects a position and selects its supporters and then gives instructions, etc., downward. I would say that certainly one of the things that originated in many respects in Latin America is the perspective that was put forward by Paulo Freire. His whole emphasis on rejecting the approach to education which involved bank knowledge, a banking concept of knowledge, in which those at the top are the ones who have the knowledge and assume that they can simply give things to people who don't have knowledge. His focus is on the importance of a horizontal dialogue, of the teacher learning from the student, that there's this no hierarchical approach here. And that's also what Marta Harnacker emphasized as well, the absolute importance of building a political instrument in which people, listen and learn, rather than a militaristic concept of a political instrument in which the people at the bottom don't really develop their capacities. So if you think in terms of the whole question of what is central is how to develop the capacities of people, you need, and also recognize that the understanding of the linking of issues, linking of struggles, etc., is not spontaneous, then you need a political instrument that can help to bring that knowledge to people by listening and learning from the people themselves. That's, I think, one of the things that always struck me about Chavez, which was the extent to which he listened to the response of people. He spoke to them regularly in his Allo Presidente sessions, in which he would always have people make points and he would respond to the points, etc. He was truly remarkable in terms of his understanding that, one of the things he often said was, you can't solve the problem of poverty unless you give power to the poor. So he was extremely significant in that respect. And to a very significant extent, his heritage lives on not so much in the government that exists there now, but in the communes, in the rural areas, and also in some of the cities like in Caracas.
Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for listening to Latin Waves. Latin Waves is an independently produced syndicated radio program made available for free to campus and community radios, and also to the world at latinwavesmedia.com. Please visit the website to hear previous shows, hear about upcoming events, and consider becoming a member for as little as $1 per month.